Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday, family. Hello, everyone. As you are coming in, please feel free to drop in the chat who you are and where you are tuning in from. Is the chat working? That is a good question. Thank you, Angela. Chat is disabled, so we've got to enable the chat. There we go. I was like, what are y'all doing? Are y'all leaving me hanging? All right. Hi, Philip from Toronto. Wow. Hi, Nikita. Hi, Susie. We've got Nebraska, Tampa. Hello, Texas. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Tampa. Hello, West Virginia, Salt Lake City. It's my favorite part. Everyone's tuning in from everywhere. Mentor, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Knoxville, Tennessee. All right. Hello, Indiana, Arizona, Colorado. More Big Brothers, Big Sisters. Jewish Big Brothers, Big Sisters of LA. Hi, Oakland. All right, everyone. We will get started in just a couple minutes. Happy Thursday. Happy Little Friday, Friday Junior, Friday's Child. All right. Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania, more Big Brothers, Big Sisters. Hi, Oregon. Still got people coming in. Tampa is all in here. Hi, Tampa. Washington. All right, Prince George County, Maryland. Boys and Girls Club. All right, everyone. Well, I am so excited that you all are here. Like I said, happy Thursday. We are going to jump right into it. You are in for definitely a needed and special treat today. We're going to be centering a wonderful topic that I think is going to be very important and just very refreshing for everyone who's tuned in. All right, so just a few housekeeping things to remember. Keep your self muted. You've already been muted. You're going to type your questions in the Q&A panel. If you have any comments or anything that you want to type, go ahead and put that in the chat box. Live captions are actually available in the panel. Just click on the CC at the bottom of the screen. We're just going to do a little poll, just a couple of polls to see who's in the room. So please respond to the polls if you can. That kind of helps us out. Let's see. You can go ahead to the next slide. one thing we want you to know is that you will be able to receive this recording. It's going to be on the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series website. You'll have access to the PDF of the slides, and you'll have all of the resources that are going to be given today as well. And then, of course, we always want to know how we can improve what we do. So when we send the survey towards the end of the webinar, we would love if you would just, of course, take time to give some feedback. So for today's webinar, we are going to be talking about self-care, but more so within the context of the systems that we have to exist in. We're going to talk about care just as a sustainable practice. We'll identify some pitfalls that we kind of go into when we think about care. And then, of course, we'll share some practical tools that you can use for implementation. So we have a couple of people with us today. Our facilitator is going to be Dr. Nishan Battle. Dr. Battle is the author of Black Girlhood, Punishment and Resistance, Reimagining Justice for Black Girls in Virginia. She's an associate professor at Virginia State University and was the principal investigator of the Stop School Violence Grant, which was funded by the U.S. Department of Justice. And she has written extensively on Black girlhood and self-care. In addition to that, Dr. Battle is a self-care coach and wellness consultant, and she is on the board of directors for a youth-based nonprofit organization for girls named Pretty Purpose. And Ishan is also a consultant for Mentor Virginia, a statewide mentoring program that's an affiliate of our nationwide network that provides technical assistance to youth-based nonprofit organizations, specifically in the state of Virginia. So you can learn more about her work and interests on her website, www.drnishanbattle.com. And for our guest today, we have Estefany Martinez Alfonso. Estefany, pronouns they and she, is a queer second-generation Indigenous triracial person dedicated to remembering their cultural traditions. This path comes winding through the Kumangoto people in Venezuela to Boston to Maine. With nature, solidarity, community, and heart centered in their work, they support organizations in examining patterns of tendencies, default structures, formal and informal cultures. They illuminate pathways to leadership, education practices, and organizational modalities that are rooted in more supportive and mutual paradigms that make room for everyone's true gifts to thrive. These days, Estefany has been excited to support the Maine Environmental Association and the Nature Connection Network in curriculum design and creating mechanisms for developmental self-reflection and conflict transformation. And then our other guest for today is Sylvia Hadnot. Sylvia, pronouns they and she, is a multicultural educator, artist, systems thinker, thoughtful collaborator, doer, and a unique and effective leader. With a master's in education, Sylvia brings both traditional academic background and real-world experience into their work. Sylvia is passionate about supporting adults with creating and maintaining the systems that need to be built for a more liberated, powerful, and agitational community members. So before we actually get into it, I would love to just see who is actually in the room. So we're going to do a little poll. You should see a poll that will pop up on your screen. So what best describes your role in the mentoring field? You should be able to see it on your screen. Are you a program staff or practitioner? Are you a part of our national affiliate? Are you a mentor, an educator, maybe a technical assistance provider, a researcher, funder, or other? All right, so it looks like we've got a lot of mentoring program staff and practitioners, a few people from our national or state level affiliates. We got some mentors in the room, educators, a few technical assistance providers, researchers, and we have some funders in the room and quite a few people who picked other. Well, I know that we are all in need of some care. So we've just got one more question. What is your experience level in the mentoring field? Would you consider yourself like a beginner, just getting your feet wet, experienced, or would you consider yourself expert? All right, so we've got quite the mix with most people considering themselves experienced. Well, my hope is that today that you will take something from this webinar that you're able to take back with you to your organizations, that you're also able to model this for young people, because young people will end up being employers and people within the workforce. And that, of course, that you'll just be able to take something for yourself. So we are going to actually get right into it. So take it away, Nishan.
Thank you so much, Bianca. And thank you so much, Sylvia and Stephanie, for presenting today. We are all so excited for what you all have to bring. Rereading your bios, I just want to thank you for what you're doing for the community. It's really needed. And so I just wanted to send that thank you to you. So let's just start off. Sylvia, how do you define self-care?
Thanks, Nishan, and thank you so much for the warm welcome, and from you and also from Bianca, and thank you everybody who's here supporting and to receive what we're going to do today. So to answer your question, how do I define self-care? Well, I first learned about self-care, and it wasn't called self-care at the time. To me, but what I understand it to be is the practice of meeting my own needs, and taking care of myself. And I think oftentimes when we hear the phrase or term self-care these days, we can think of things like bubble bath or like get a massage or different kind of like spa type things. And those things can meet our needs. And also, the term self-care actually has some deep roots in Black feminist theory. So if you click next on the slide, this quote will pop up from Audre Lorde. And this is a quote about self-care. And she shares that she really came up with this concept of self-care after examining overextension and how much overextending herself really caused her to not be able to actually meet her own needs. And so she really, when she talked about self-care and talks about self-care, what it means is that she is actually prioritizing the act of meeting her own needs, whether her situation allows it with ease or not. And so she's taking on the responsibility of figuring out what she needs to do in order to create a situation where she can actually meet her own needs. And, based on many of the systems that are around us, she actually goes all out and says that this is an act of political warfare, because there are so many systems around us that keep us from meeting our own needs, kind of intentionally, actually. Stephanie, I'm wondering if you might want to jump in and build on that a little bit.
Hi, everybody. I wish I said hi earlier. Just want to echo everything that Sylvia has already said in gratitude. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for hosting and listening. I think, I don't know that there's very much that I want to add, Sylvia. I feel like, yeah, maybe I'll just emphasize the the multitude of needing to hold multitudes of multiple truths, and that the way that we sometimes find solace and the way that we sometimes find care for ourselves is like a girls' night out, or like some time alone in the woods, or like sitting in front of Netflix and watching your favorite TV show while watching Netflix and chill ice cream, not talking about anybody in particular here, but needing to hold that truth of care for ourselves while simultaneously holding like, okay, this is also very individualized, it's rejuvenating for this moment, and it leads to a point that we'll make later about sustainability, but we won't get there quite yet. So I think that's all I wanted to emphasize and add. Thanks.
Well, Stephanie, what does self-care mean in the context of, I would say, current systems?
Yeah. So I think with so many of you, I think even with our poll, it's kind of hard to see where we're coming all into this, but I heard there were many experts. But even with that, I think in what I'm expressing today, I'm making I'm making two assumptions. And it's the first one is that we understand how inextricably linked the conversations and impacts of capitalism have on self-care. And the second assumption that I'm also making is that you're here because you really care. Whether you are a new hire or an ED or a board member, definitely someone's child, perhaps an auntie, and certainly a community member, right? So, yeah. And so a lot of us understand that a large piece of capitalism, not the whole piece, but a large piece of capitalism is the implementation of artificial scarcity. And I think we tend to think about that. Our mind almost goes directly to something on an economic level. And I want to draw our attention to artificial scarcity of our own capacities and what we are capable of in this talk. And there's a lot of reasons for this that are so real when we talk about the scarcity of our capacity. As individuals and as communities, we run into this all the time. And there are many impacts of this as well. So I'm not broadening out the scope just for the sake of time and what we're here for, but we all know that there's so much more that we can talk about. And so I bring this up because I think it's super important to keep sharp in our awarenesses of our current systems and what they actually and what they are, and keep talking about them because of how insidious and also because white supremacy culture touches all of us, regardless of where we come from. And I think I also bring that up because I've heard before, like for example, I love to talk about dismantling our hierarchies and shifting more towards work cultures that are more egalitarian, more democratic. What I really mean by that is more indigenous, but I've heard before folks be like, well, why are we stuck in the past? Like, why do we keep talking about this thing? And I just really need to emphasize in that moment, I was like, wow, that's such a privileged comment to make. Why it is that we keep talking about it. And I don't even know that I need to say it, but like, it's a continuation of colonization and capitalism. Our impacts are very real and still very present. We're not just talking about something from in the olden ages, you know what I'm saying? And so one of the big intentions of this current dominant culture is to keep us busy. We have to be so busy trying to meet our own individual needs due to the constructed, manufactured economic or resource scarcity that we don't have time to practice the ethic of community care or solidarity. It reduces people's capacities to organize and to meet our own needs together, keeping us reliant, right? And often keeping us reliant and often caught in the mindset of individualism that grows so quickly from the ways that we are kept in survival mode, doing the best we can for our families and our elders, our children, our friends, never mind a stranger, right? And so I'm bringing it up because I think it's hard to keep the sharpness present all the time, given the fact that it is just so hard to look at in our daily lives, the impacts of them. Keeps us away from that sharp awareness that I think many of us have deep in our bones of how generosity is seeped throughout the waters and soils of the earth. You know what I mean? Would you add anything, Sylvia?
Thanks, Stephanie, for bringing all of that in. I think one thing I would build on that with would just be that maybe just like a little bit of an example. So, so often, like those of us, especially working at nonprofits, where we don't have the same kinds of, bonuses and frill as they might at a tech company. We don't necessarily have the, what is the little games in the game room and different things like that, or several $1,000 bonuses at Christmas time or holidays. But so oftentimes we're really overextending ourselves and working longer hours than our bodies actually have the capacity for. And so what that ends up doing is exactly what Stephanie was just talking about. It disrupts our ability to actually meet our needs. When you've worked a 10-hour day, all you want to do is go home, flop on the couch, maybe participate in a less than healthy coping mechanism, like drinking a little bit too much wine, and then lay down and sleep and do it again the next day. And that's not really meeting your needs. But what you are doing is meeting the needs of the business bottom line. You're meeting the needs of whatever has been written into the grant. You're meeting those needs, and you're deprioritizing your own individual needs, and like as Stephanie was saying, the needs of your close people, and therefore also, of course, just like as Stephanie said, forget a stranger. You can't meet their needs either. So yeah, that's all I would add there.
Absolutely, that was wonderful, Sylvia. So, Sylvia, how can self-care become more sustainable?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nishan. So we can take a peek at the next slide. Yeah, so some of the stuff that Stephanie and I were just talking about is really kind of the effects of the individualism culture, which is a product of prioritizing products over people, or business bottom lines over people, or the constant churn and burn of producing for capitalism over people and our actual human needs. And so it can feel really overwhelming to even think about self-care, because, oh my gosh, I have to pay rent. I got to pay my healthcare bill. I can't do that without going to work. So, what am I supposed to do? Just, tell my boss, I'm only going to work 37 hours a week now. Sorry, because they'll just go find somebody else to hire, right? So it could feel really overwhelming. However, and you can move to the next slide. what we can do is actually start to lean in toward these concepts of reciprocity and networks. So I really like this quote. Some of you may be familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass, and if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. And so she really shares about how reciprocity is one of the tools we can use to actually make self-care sustainable. That means, reciprocity is all about give and take, right? And yeah, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so give and take, that means being able to and committing to and prioritizing really showing up in your relationships and in your communities and figuring out ways to actually build networks. We can actually learn a lot about network building from plants. Oh, no, actually, I left this out of my slide. So my master's in education actually is a specialty in environmental education. So I care a lot about plants and learning from them. And I think plants have done a really good job of resisting the churn and burn of capitalism and figuring out how to show up in their natural way in this world, which is really amazing. And so mushrooms are a particularly amazing species of living being. I'm not actually sure I can call them a plant, to be honest, but that would require an entirely separate webinar where we get deep and nerdy about mushrooms. Anyway, point being, they do have really reciprocal relationships with a lot of plants. And so mushrooms, they pop up above ground, but underground, they have this entire network, and it's kind of like a root system. So if you're a gardener, when you pull out a plant and it has all those really fun roots, you can pull the dirt out of and tease them out from each other. Mycorrhizal networks is what you call the kind of root system of mushrooms. And the cool thing about it is that they actually send information to other plants and to other mushrooms. So for example, if one tree in a forest becomes sick, the mushrooms through their mycorrhizal networks will actually support that tree in calling out to the other trees and saying, hey, I'm sick, we need to do something about this. And then based on the tree's own self-knowledge of the disease that it's gotten, it'll say, okay, this is what's going on with me, and this is what you need to do in order to protect yourself from this disease that's coming into our community. And the mushroom network will support by sending that information to all the other trees in the area. And so what I think is so amazing about this is that the tree is the one that got sick is being honest and saying, hey, I got sick with this thing, we should do something about it. And then the rest of the trees are like, oh my gosh, we should totally do something about it. And then they prioritize the health of the community, meeting the health of that one tree, showing up and supporting that one tree because it needs a little extra help right now because it's not doing so hot. And they understand that when they show up for that tree, it is actually also them showing up for themselves. Because what they get to do is protect themselves and the community from getting that disease as well. And we can learn a lot from that way of being as humans. Stephanie, what would you add to that?
I love that. Just a fun little anecdote. There's a guy who I'm not remembering whose name it is right now. Maybe I'll think about it later, but I remember him talking about mycorrhizal networks and calling it the way that they communicate with one another and how widespread they are. He calls it the wood wide web.
Yeah,
Really cute.
that is cute.
So Stephanie, what are some common pitfalls that people typically fall into when they're trying out sustainable self-care?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so many. Not to discourage anybody, but really so many. Um, because of the ways that capitalism, patriarchy, aspects of colonialism all really feed off of one another. And those are a lot of systems, to be countering all the time. And so, because that is the air that we like breathe and speak in and function in, and like the whole world goes around in that way artificially, let's remember that. Um, there's so much work that we have to do as individuals and in community to swim against that, to swim against that current. And so it's why there are so many pitfalls. If our baseline, not everybody, but if our baseline, especially the way that, because of racism and all of these other isms, like especially for people of color, indigenous, Black folks, like if there's a kind of generalized baseline survival mode that we constantly are working through, trying to move through, it's easy to fall into that individualized mindset that we've already mentioned a couple of times already. Even when we want to be in a communal mindset, even when we have or learn the language of being in a communal mindset, even when we have witnesses, even when we've witnessed glimpses of the possibility of this living. But just because we have the desire and the will for it, that doesn't equal actually implementing that, right? So there's a lot of work that we constantly need to be navigating, every step of the way. It's much easier. I love this saying. It's much easier to fall into something, right? Fall into something, allow for gravity to just kind of do the work. And it's much harder to rise up to become something different or do something different. It is much harder, but we want to rise. And so it has to be an everyday conscious practice on multiple levels. Like, we have on this slide, urgency, we have burnout, we have this concept of saviorism that I think I'll leave it for you to talk about. Also this concept of ignorance and disguises. What are the ways that the things that we practice might actually be disguises of the perpetuation of the practices that we don't actually want to be practicing. But we're stuck in this busy go, give until you don't have hustle within, especially within nonprofits, but just as the way that capitalism makes the world turn around, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So again, like we can't yoga our way out of structural poverty or racism or any of these isms. And so I think one thing that I want to say about one little like focal point about pitfalls that I really want to bring to your attention is oh my gosh, I almost lost it. Oh, is the fact that because this dominant culture is so entrenched, has so much history, it doesn't mean that we have what it takes to change the systems, to change the way that we show up in our organizations, in our meetings, in our day-to-day meetings, just implementing one thing here and more as we go along, and we build and we grow and we grow and we grow toward the direction that we want to be going. But while we're doing that work, there is so much against us. And the point that I want to make sure that, like, if anything I want you to walk away with is that we're human, and that while we're working to grow in our self-awareness about how these systems show up and manifest within our own practices, almost every single day, that's okay. If we, I think Miriam Kaba said something similar. If we stop trying to put our energy into focusing on like not being a system or not being a white supremacist or not being capitalist or not being or not, perpetuating harm in those particular ways. I think we should have a self-conscious practice about those things. But the point is that we're going to keep running into it. And if we just instead shift our focus towards understanding that and accepting that, yeah, we manifest those things, like we have those things, we can then put that down of trying not to be that thing and focus on, okay, I accept that. I accept the pieces of that are a part of me. And this is how I'm going to take a slightly different shift or step this
Mhm.
in the next time, or
Stephanie, I just wanted to maybe take one of the pitfalls, and if you were, and I'm pretty sure that we all understand many of these terms and concepts that you're using. If you were speaking to a community group that had never attended college, and maybe some of these concepts and things are going over their head, in I don't want to say layman's terms, but just in accessible language, how would you describe disguises as a common pitfall?
Thank you. That's interesting. I think perhaps in an example, disguise can be like, because we're talking about organizations, disguise might be actually something that I see very often, is that in our urgency culture, the thing that we just default to a lot, that maybe one person or maybe two people, a group of people, whatever it is, like particular people, a person will have this idea and be really excited about this idea and go down this pitfall, or not pitfall, go down this rabbit hole, let's call it a rabbit hole, of how to implement this idea. I'm so excited about it. I want to tell everybody, I think this is a great avenue for how we move forward in whatever project it is that we're doing. And they bring that to the group and they're like, hey, I have this great idea. I really want to roll with it. Like, what do y'all think? And there's all this excitement, all this emotionality, right? And all of a sudden, our group, we find ourselves in moving in that direction, to later realize, like, wait, we didn't actually, that wasn't actually a consensus process. Oh, wait, actually, we did that way too fast. I think I have more questions about this direction. Wait, I think that, I didn't get to voice what it is that I really wanted to say about that, some of my concerns. So a disguise in that case is like, oh, I have energy, I have time, I have motivation for this thing that I think could really move us in the right direction. But the pitfall is that it's actually, the question is like, where does that come from though? And how is it that we walk from that place? Because while we might have great intentions about the thing that we're excited about in this case, the impacts of that was we were saying like, oh, this is a collaborative process in how we get there, when really maybe it wasn't as collaborative from the get-go. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, yes. Absolutely. Hold on, I'm just trying to look at the chat. Okay, yes, yes. I want to thank you for that, because I just want to make sure that everyone understands exactly where we're going with this. So maybe even let's take another one. Now, this one seems pretty straightforward, but can you give an example, saviorism as a common pitfall?
Yeah, I think Sylvia could actually.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. So I think something that's interesting about saviorism, especially when it comes to nonprofits, is that sometimes our entire organization's purpose is about helping or rescuing. And so this can be a really easy pitfall to fall into, when we are in some like social good organizations. That doesn't mean that doing social good is something that we should avoid. But I do think that something as Stephanie touched on is being critical of the ways that we might be used to doing things or the status quo, while also having compassion for yourself while you are learning to grow a new way. And so with nonprofits, I think saviorism is a particular one that's important to be critical of. And sometimes it can just show up as seeing, sometimes we have like a perspective that other people are in a deficit. So we might look at a particular community that our work is particularly targeted toward and see them as having a deficit of their needs not being met. And then we might think, oh, well, I have access to all these resources, so I'm going to go help those people over there by rationing out some of these resources I have access to, so that they can get their needs met. And sometimes that actually creates this cycle where we make other people dependent on our structures in order to get their needs met. And it can be more powerful to support people with getting access directly to the resources, so that they can actually learn to meet their own needs and learn to build on those resources in their communities, so their communities themselves can actually become more powerful, as opposed to dependent on the filtering of those resources through our orgs. And this, this can also just show up in interpersonal relationships too. Like, I don't know about y'all, but for me, one of the ways that I've been critical of saviorism showing up in my life is with my siblings, because like siblings that I'm older than, I have this thought that, okay, I have to be their protector. I got to make sure their life is okay. I got to make sure that they're doing good. And that's all well and good. And it's not bad. It's not a bad intention that I have. It comes from a place of love. And also it can be more powerful when I just take a step back, let them learn and grow and see where their life is going to take them, because sometimes that, even when it comes from a good intentioned place, it can actually really just kind of be a control mechanism, which keeps people back from learning to support themselves and learning to show up as a contributing member of community. And also it can teach them how to, it might teach them some habits of receiving care that aren't the healthiest either. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no, you go ahead. Thank you, Nishan.
Oh, no problem. Thank you both for this really insightful conversation. So being a self-care coach and being in just that wellness arena, often what we see is what self-care isn't. Like I heard you earlier say we can't yoga ourselves out of it. I've heard people, in so many different platforms say, it's more than a bubble bath, it's more than a pedicure. And so we have now discussed all of the ways that self-care is not. But then when we think about, okay, well, then what can we do? Because for decades, we've been discussing these systems, et cetera. And so, Stephanie, how do we build new systems while also extracting ourselves from old ones?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And also thank you for poking a little bit deeper into some of those concepts. I appreciate that.
Oh, no problem.
Here we are working to break out of the confines that we're bound by that manufactured scarcity or individualism. And so I think a couple of things that come to mind right away is really holding in the forefront that knowledge about our humanness and the fact that we are natural, that we are nature, that we are literally water, earth, air, and fire, that we are land, and therefore live in cycles. We have cycles within us, right? And so understanding that our learning and our growth is always in that cyclical pattern, where we take 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back perhaps, and then again, you know? And so really keeping that really sharp in our attempts to be growing or outgrowing or dismantling, whatever it is, the language that we want to use. And the second thing is practicing the ways that we support each other to show up authentically in our work. You know, really trying to center the ways in which there is abundance in the world. Like I was saying from the very beginning, like there's so much work that needs to happen to keep us as working people away from the fact that this world is actually so generous and so giving.
Let me rephrase it a little bit. You have now I'm just throwing out a hypothetical scenario. You have a single mother, 2 children. She works a 9 to 5, maybe even has another job on the side. She doesn't understand any of these terms about centering, supremacy, or anything like that. She just knows that she is tired and burnt out. She doesn't feel like she can go to her manager because she feels like she might get fired if she speaks up. How can she begin to create a new system? What can she do specifically?
I watched my mom do this, so maybe I'll speak from that place. My mom is a single mom. I'm the oldest of 3, so everything that you were saying, Sylvia, is really, really hitting me. And what I watched her and my grandmother do is, one, rely on one another, right? But I watched the way that they were in conversation and dialogue all the time within our community, that they would communicate with other parents, my mom, especially with other single moms, about some of those hardships, which required her to be vulnerable in that reality.
Yeah.
And it was a way to invite into deeper relationship, into like, oh, your kid walks home from school by himself from the bus stop at this time. I'm watching out for him. I'm looking out the window to make sure he actually made it to that door. My mom would come home super, super late. So every now and then we'd had a neighbor who would bring over a dinner for us, a plate of food. But you know what I mean? It's like, it's through the dialogue, it's through that vulnerability, as opposed to the thing that we can sometimes like get so closed in. I think it has to do with shame or
Absolutely.
or what it is that we're taught to not value. And I watched the way that she just completely would tear that down. Like it's not saying that she wouldn't feel shame, because I think that that is true. If my mom were here, she would probably say that. But there was a vulnerability in taking that step of having that dialogue with neighbors to keep an eye out for one another.
Thank you for that intimate example that you gave us, and that, you know, making it hit home for us all. Thank you so much for that. Sylvia, do you have anything to add with that question before I go on to the next question?
Yeah, thanks, Nishan. I would love to. I think relationships are sustaining, and they're sustaining from a functional and practical standpoint. Like literally your neighbor can support with watching you when it's late at night if your mom is not available, or somebody bringing you a meal like Stephanie shared. And also as a species, you know, humans, we really evolved or were created, or both, or some combination of however we arrived here on Earth. We are a pack animal. And so even just as minute and deep down as brain science and nervous system science, relationships are also sustaining in that way. There's actually studies that have been done that show that isolation is one of the worst things you can do for a human being. You can actually end up not even learning how to talk if you are isolated at a young enough age, and you'll just never learn to talk your whole life. And it's also one of the cruelest punishments that we use in the criminal legal system. And that's done intentionally because it really does tear you down to be alone. And that's one of the things that, when we're overwhelmed with these systems or how challenging our lives can feel, we might just sort of fall into a pitfall of being alone. And so, yeah, really remembering that, I don't know about y'all, but when somebody tells me you should call your friend, I'm like, okay, thanks for telling me what I shoulda, coulda, woulda did, and that can feel kind of annoying. But when someone says, well, actually, it gets a little nerdy with me and says, brain science wise, calling your friend could actually be a good prescription for how you're feeling and making sure that you stay sustained in your life. Then I'm like, okay, I guess if it's good for my brain, I will force myself to reach out, be a little vulnerable, be open. And so I just want to encourage you that this is not just a shoulda, coulda, woulda, or a nice thing to do. This is literally relationships and leaning into your relationships vulnerably and openly and honestly. It's kind of like taking a vitamin. It's something that you need in your life that's nutritious for you. That's part of living a whole healthy life. So if that's what you needed to lean into vulnerable relationships, I just want to give that to you.
Love it. Sylvia, what tools can you send people home with?
Yeah, so before we go to the next slide, I just want to say these two things on the slide that are shown right now, they might not seem like tools, but they actually kind of are. So I'm going to talk about these first, and then I'll talk about some really tangible resources that you can click on and stuff. So mutual aid, as Stephanie put this quote in here, cooperation for the sake of common good by Miriam Kaba. And it's really, I think mutual aid is a term that has been thrown out around a lot, especially since 2020 and some of the uprisings that happened in various cities that year. But at its root, what this means is just kind of showing up and being a part of your community. So that's definitely a tool that you can use. And then also embodiment. So embodiment is when something goes from theoretical knowledge to actually being something that's a part of your life and a part of your way of being. So that's why I said, it can be important to be critical, although it's also important to have compassion for yourself as you're being critical, because punishing yourself is not an effective way to change your behavior. But yeah, start to think about, okay, when it comes to some of those pitfalls, where are those showing up in my life? What is one or two or three small things that I could shift in my daily life so that I can start to embody some of this theoretical knowledge a little bit more? Because it's all well and good to yada, 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 la, la, la about all this stuff, but change happens when we actually start to practice it, when it becomes a part of our lives. So maybe that means, set up a once monthly Zoom date with your friend that moved out of town so that you can stay in like vulnerable communication and vulnerable relationship with somebody. What are some ways you can be intentional about implementing some of these changes that Stephanie and I have been talking about? And the cool thing about implementing these changes is that when you do it in one area, you start to become more sensitive to how these pitfalls are showing up in other areas. So just making a small shift in your home life will actually also change the way you start to show up at work. And then that actually becomes contagious. And this is another brain science thing. We have these things in our brains called mirror neurons. And so what that means is it's the I see, I do function. So if you've ever seen a little baby and you go, at the baby, what do they do back? They go, right? And we have those as adults too. So when you start to make these little incremental changes and you start to show up differently in your workplace, people around you will take notice of it and they'll start leaning into those shifts as well. So we can go to the next, or actually, before we go to the next slide, anything you wanted to add to that, Stephanie, and then I can get in the weeds with the resources.
I just love that you're touching on the normalization of these small practices as big as small as they are, and I loved your examples too about, little changes individually. If you're here and you are in a position of power where, in your organization, I've witnessed, an example, I've witnessed, EDs sometimes in our work, we work past the normal kind of 9 to 5. And what they've done is if there is ever a meeting that goes beyond that, or an evening meeting or whatever it is, that they provide childcare for their children, which is a helpful way, especially if it's a consistent offering that parents can rely on that support, and we normalize parts of those mutual aid efforts as well.
Yeah, and just building on that too, I would say if you are in a position of power, or you have more sway over the budget and stuff like that, one way that the saviorism pitfall can show up is that you think to yourself, oh, this awesome webinar by Stephanie and Sylvia, I'm gonna go change everything about the way our workplace is set up. And that can be great. That's a great intention. And I would say, do some listening sessions with your team. Ask them what are their needs. So that way you make sure, as somebody who has power over the budget and can make those kinds of changes, that you're actually making changes that will meet the needs of your people, as opposed to you thinking, what they want. Ask. So on the next slide, we have some practical resources. So we linked to the book that we referenced earlier, Braiding Sweetgrass, as well as some readings that you can do about mutual aid and where it came from, and white supremacy culture and how it shows up. We also linked some talks that you can dig into for further ponderings of these concepts. So the Audre Lorde quote that we opened with comes from this talk called Self-Care as Political Warfare. And then there's also a talk on mutual aid for survival and solidarity. And at the top of the slide, I'm so excited. Stephanie and I, but oh my gosh, it's nearing the end of the webinar and my mouth is done. Okay. Stephanie and I created a toolkit, just especially for you all. And so I don't know if we can actually share screen on the toolkit right now, if that is accessible to our friend that is sharing the screen. But there's two things there. Yeah, we are going to share the links to all of this at the end, or in the email, but I can also share it in the chat. So this is the link to the conversation toolkit. And then we also have another tool that was developed by my organization called Problem Solving Circle, and I'll put that in the chat as well, so you all can look at it right now. So the Problem Solving Circle is basically it's a practice for talking about stuff. And so you can use the conversation toolkit and the problem solving practice together, or you can use them separately. But I will just highlight a couple of cool things about these two tools, and then maybe Stephanie, if you want to add anything, if I forget. But the cool thing about the problem solving practice is that it really centers relationships. So often in organizations, when we notice that something's going wrong or we want to change something, we center the problem. And what this problem solving practice does is it kind of invites you to think about the problem as like a campfire, and it might be part of the reason that we're coming together. But the important thing is that we're gathering together. I think I added the links to the chat, but I'm not sure. Maybe one of my co-supporters can help out with that. I think I
Yeah,
maybe
they were
only-
added. Two of them were added to, two of the links were added to the chat, and you should be able to just click directly on it.
Okay, thanks, Nishan. So, oh, maybe I only shared them to the host and panelists. Maybe
Oh,
Yeah, I was just noticing.
okay. I'm not sure how to actually share in the chat, so maybe,
I can
One-
drop it. I can drop it.
okay. Thanks, Stephanie. So, yeah, it's really, so just like we were talking about, you can move the needle in small, subtle ways to lean into more of this culture of care versus the culture of overwhelm and burnout. And so what this practice does is there's a lot of really small intentional pieces to it that get you in the practice of making those small incremental movements toward more of a culture of care. So if you do decide to use this, I would recommend following the directions to a T. Do not skip any of the steps. It might feel impractical or unnecessary at first, but after you do it several times, you'll start to realize, oh, that's why they recommended that we sit in a circle. Oh, that's why we start out with gratitude. Oh, that's why we close with connection. Because just like I was talking about earlier, based on brain science, the more we actually practice something, the more we create neurological pathways in our brain to normalize that thing. And so again, even when we just make little shifts in one area of our life, those shifts end up affecting the other areas of our lives as well. And we start to move toward the culture of care. And then with the other piece, the conversation toolkit, basically, we wanted to give you all some questions that you can use to talk about this stuff together. So the conversation toolkit basically can be a guide for how you can continue the conversation of what we've begun here in this webinar in your organizations. And I hope that this webinar is actually a middle point on that path for you. I hope this is not the beginning, and I hope it is not the end. If it is the beginning, welcome. So glad to have you here. And I hope that you continue walking down this path and that the conversation toolkit can be supportive for you all. Anything else you want to add about the tools, Stephanie?
Yeah, just one thing. I think we already wrote it in here. We're talking about transformation. It doesn't happen overnight. It's the continuation of the conversation. And so we're excited to have shared some for lack of a better word right now, maybe buzzwords, a lot of words that we used here today, to find the relationships between certain words and other words that I think often when we speak, I know I do this all the time. I think when we speak to one another, sometimes we just glaze the surface. And so this is a tool where we're like, well, how do we go in one layer deeper, 2 layers deeper? And the one thing that I want to name about this toolkit is that go back to the same questions. And you'll find that, in a month from now, when you go back to the same question, you actually feel differently about it. You have more experience in that month of being like, oh yeah, I was really impacted by that. And keep in mind that when you're working through some of these questions, it's possible for things to come up, for our emotional, for different perhaps triggers even, about relating to self-care. I don't know if everybody can actually point to somebody in their life who they can rely on to call, right? And that's really real. And so just when we're talking about self-care, like keep self-care, in mind, together, and supporting one another as you're working through some of these resources. I think that's all that I'll add.
Cool.
I also shared something in the chat. It's called white supremacy culture and then something different. For those who are in leadership positions, or those who may just feel like they have that agency within the circles that they are in to start the conversation of how we can take some of those tenets and slowly begin breaking them down. I know this tool has been useful in some of the spaces that I've been in, such as shifting from the quantitative to the qualitative. Making sure that we are giving realistic workloads and deadlines and budgeting for additional time. Like if we say it's going to take 3 months, then we're going to budget for 6 months. So just some practical things that people can take with them that maybe they can start slowly implementing or even putting into their regular processes, policies, and procedures.
Thank you, Bianca. That's such an awesome resource. I just opened it and just took a quick peek. It's really awesome.
Thanks.
Okay, so this is how you can contact our panelists. Sylvia Hadnot at sylvia@haseverything.co. And is the other one your website, www.haseverything.co?
Yes, and I also am going to make a shameless plug that I have a book coming out about much of what we talked about today called We Have Everything. And that'll be coming out in the new year. So definitely feel free to check out my website and take note of the book when it drops in January.
Congratulations, absolutely.
Thank you.
And then a Stephanie Martinez Alfonso. We have a Stephanie at mycorising.com, and then www.mycorising.com is the website where you can find more information. Thank you both so very, very much for this insightful and just relatable topic for us all. Thank you so much. Okay, you can even hear my hand clap. Yes, okay. All right, so I think we need the next slide. All right, so additional resources are right here. Affiliates serves as a clearinghouse for training, resources, public awareness, and advocacy. You can find more information at the link right there, www.mentoring.org. We also have Mentoring Connector that recruits mentors by submitting your program to the Mentor Connector at connect.mentoring.org. Lastly, the National Mentoring Resource Center. You can check out more at the OJJDP National Mentoring Resource Center to have access to more evidence-based mentoring resources and to also apply for the no-cost training and technical assistance. Oh yeah, lots of thank yous in the chat. Lots of thank yous in the chat. We definitely want to thank you. And remember, after the webinar, please help us out by answering the survey questions at the end. Everyone will receive an email with information on how to download the slides, recording, and more resources right here at this link, mentoring.org/program, resources, training, opportunities, all of that. Okay. And again, please stay connected. Email at collaborative webinar series at mentoring.org. Tweet with the hashtag mentoring webinar, and just visit the webpage on the Mentor website for past and upcoming webinars. And some great ones. And we'd love to hear from you. So if you have any questions, please type your questions in the Q&A panel so that the wonderful panelists can answer any questions that you may have. You can just type those right where it says Q&A. Okay. All right. Still looking for questions and answers. Okay. The next slide, please. Okay. And next month, excuse me, I have a slight cold. Next month, we are going to have a wonderful webinar entitled Supporting Newly Arrived Young People from Immigrant and Refugee Populations Through Mentoring and Family Support, which will be December 17th, exactly a month from now, at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
I see there is a question.
I sure do.
Yeah, will either panelist be attending the National Mentoring Summit? So that is taking place in January. I think there's some people who may want to dig deep, really dig deeper into this.
I was not aware of that until now. But I would be happy to dig deeper on this stuff and see what makes sense. So if that makes sense, then yes.
Yeah, neither did I, so I will certainly take a look.
And if we're not able to come, then I definitely would, recommend reaching out via email. And you can always connect with Stephanie and myself that way too.
Absolutely. Do we have
So
any
I do
more
have a
questions?
question. Yeah, I have a question. So for those who may not be employed in places where they actually have any power to do any of these shifts, what are your recommendations for things that they can do within, sort of, I guess, quietly modeling, that change without having to fear that, hey, I'm not going to get my workload, taken care of, because I think we do have to recognize that some people are in specific positions of power where they do have more agency to enact change, and then some people may not.
Do you want to start or do you want me to, Stephanie?
No, go ahead, feel free.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, Bianca. Thank you. Because the reality is that many of us work in organizations that are deeply hierarchical, and we don't have the same kind of power to actually have sway over the budget, or some of us work in organizations that we're actually kind of talk to the boss, or we don't feel supported by leadership as well. So that's a really important question. And I would say, think about what, and you can even do this as like a journaling activity if you want to, but maybe think about a list of things you do have control and influence over, and start there. Because again, we're just like Stephanie said earlier, we're talking about transformation, and transformation takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of intention. And so when we start with just ourselves and inside of ourselves, that's something that we can often have a little bit more control over. And starting with making those little incremental changes just in our own way of being is a way that we can get in the practice of what it feels like. And then those changes will affect the way that you show up in relationships. So the way that you show up with your colleagues might start to change. You might notice yourself asking more questions and listening more, taking things a little slower. Maybe if you are somebody that has a lot of due dates and deadlines, seeing if some of those can get extended by even just one day. Give yourself a little bit more time to just slow down. And yeah, I think focus on the things you do have control over as well, because when we focus so much on the things that are going wrong, sometimes it feels like that's the only thing that exists. But when you focus on what you can change and what you can do, that can feel a little bit more empowering as well.
And
Thank
lean on the
you.
relationships that you have.
Mhm.
talked about dialogue earlier, and it was the key for my family to get support. And I think I think Haruki does a really great job reminding us of, or trying to convince us that we don't have power together.
Mm.
Really lean into the relationships that you do have, a close coworker, even like Sylvia said, somebody at home, somebody in a different organization,
Mhm.
that you're bonding over whatever it is, you know,
Yeah.
the ways that you can see change. And I guarantee that whatever it is that you're feeling and that you're seeing that you want to change, that you're not the only one in that. I think Paulo Freire talks about the power of dialogue in transformational change. So I just want to bring dialogue into
Yeah.
that answer as well.
Can I actually build on that a little bit before we move on to another question? Yeah, so I actually want to give like an example in my life. So my roommate and I, we actually met a long time ago. Well, some people are older than me, so it might not seem that long to you, but for me, feels like a long time. Back in like 2014 or 15 or something, at my first job out of college. And we actually worked in mentoring, which is cool. So this is kind of full circle for me. And we connected because our work was hard and it felt really good to talk about it. And there wasn't a whole lot we could do about how hard the work was, but what we could do was talk about it. And that helped. And we are roommates now. We haven't worked together in years, but she's also somebody that I've used a lot of these different tools and techniques with as well to maintain an intentional, close, intimate friendship. So when the pandemic started, we scheduled weekly Zoom dates at 8 a.m. on Fridays. And we would just be intentional and connect with each other in that way. And she's probably the reason why I wrote a book. She's the reason why I have a website and have a company. I mean, I did all of those things, so I can give myself credit, but she's been such a strong source of intimacy, of encouragement. And our relationship started because we worked at a place that was really hard to work at because of the work that we did. And then we had no control over how hard the work was or what our workload was. But we leaned into relationship and it sustained us. And now, because we have this dialogue that we're so used to having with each other, it's built into, just like Stephanie was talking about, an abundance of work that is more easeful, an abundance of mindset shifts, an abundance of joy and connection. So I just want to share, this stuff is real. It takes time. 2014 was what, gosh darn, 7 years ago, I suppose. And but it works when you commit to it. Mhm.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. All right. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you again next time, December 17th. You all have a wonderful rest of your week, and please take care of yourselves.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Take care.